Acadia was a colony of New France in northeastern North America that included parts of eastern Quebec, the Maritime provinces, and modern-day Maine to the Kennebec River. During much of the 17th and early 18th centuries, Norridgewock on the Kennebec River and Castine at the end of the Penobscot River were the southernmost settlements of Acadia. The actual specification by the French government for the territory refers to lands bordering the Atlantic coast, roughly between the 40th and 46th parallels. Later, the territory was divided into the British colonies, which became Canadian provinces and American states. The population of Acadia included members of the Wabanaki Confederacy and descendants of emigrants from France. The two communities intermarried, which resulted in a significant portion of the population of Acadia being Emi-Akutis. The first capital of Acadia, established in 1605, was Port Royal. A British force from Virginia attacked and burned down the town in 1613, but it was later rebuilt nearby, where it remained the longest-serving capital of French Acadia until the British conquest of Acadia in 1710. Over 74 years there were 6 colonial wars, in which English and later British interests tried to capture Acadia, starting with King William's War in 1689. During these wars, along with some French troops from Quebec, some Acadians, the Wabanaki Confederacy, and French priests continuously raided New England settlements along the border in Maine. While Acadia was officially conquered in 1710 during Queen Anne's War, present-day New Brunswick and much of Maine remained contested territory. Present-day Prince Edward Island and Cape Breton, as agreed under Article 13 of the Treaty of Utrecht, remained under French control. By militarily defeating the Wabanaki Confederacy and the French priests, present-day Maine fell during Father Rail's War. During King George's War, France and New France made significant attempts to regain mainland Nova Scotia. After Father Lalauter's War, present-day New Brunswick fell to the British. Finally, during the French and Indian War, both Isle Royal and Isle St. John fell to the British in 1758. Today, Acadia is used to refer to regions of North America that are historically associated with the lands, descendants, and/or culture of the former French region. It particularly refers to regions of the Maritimes with French roots, language, and culture, primarily in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, the Magdalen Islands and Prince Edward Island, as well as in Maine. It can also be used to refer to the Acadian diaspora in southern Louisiana, a region also referred to as Acadiana. In the abstract, Acadia refers to the existence of a French culture in any of these regions. People living in Acadia, and sometimes former residents and their descendants, are called Acadians, also later known as Cajuns after resettlement in Louisiana. Etymology. The origin of the designation Acadia is credited to the explorer Giovanni da Verrazzano, who on his 16th-century map applied the ancient Greek name Arcadia to the entire Atlantic coast north of Virginia. Arcadia derives from the Arcadia district in Greece, which since classical antiquity had the extended meanings of refuge or idyllic place. The Dictionary of Canadian Biography says, Arcadia, the name Verrazzano gave to Maryland or Virginia, on account of the beauty of the trees, made its first cartographical appearance in the 1548 Gastaldo map and is the only name on that map to survive in Canadian usage. In 1603, a colony south of the St. Lawrence between the 40th and 46th parallels was agreed by Henri IV, who recognized the territory as l'Acadie. Also in the 17th century, Champlain fixed its present orthography with the R omitted. William Francis Ganong, a cartographer, has shown its gradual progress northeastwards, in a succession of maps, to its resting place in the Atlantic provinces of Canada. Another interesting note is the similarity in the pronunciation of Acadie and the Mi'kmaq suffix Acadie, which means a place of abundance. The modern usage is still seen in place names such as Shubenacadie or Shubenacadie. It is thought that intercultural conversation between early French traders and Mi'kmaq hunters may have resulted in the name L'Acadia being changed to L'Acadia. 17th century. The history of Acadia was significantly influenced by the warfare that took place on its soil during the 17th and 18th century. Prior to that time period, the Mi'kmaq lived in Acadia for centuries. The French arrived in 1604, and Catholic Mi'kmaq and Acadians were the predominant populations in the colony for the next 150 years. Early European colonists, who would later become known as Acadians, were French subjects primarily from the Plie-Martin to Poitiers in the Vienne département of west-central France. The first French settlement was established by Pierre Duguay des Monts, governor of Acadia, under the authority of King Henry IV, on St. Croix Island in 1604. The following year, the settlement was moved across the Bay of Fundy to Port Royal after a difficult winter on the island and deaths from scurvy. In 1607 the colony received bad news. King Henry had revoked Sieur de Mont's royal fur monopoly, citing that the income was insufficient to justify supplying the colony further. Thus recalled, the last of the Acadians left Port Royal in August 1607. Their allies, the native Mi'kmaq nation, kept careful watch over their possessions, though. When the former lieutenant governor, Jean de Biencourt de Poutrincourt de Saint-Just, returned in 1610, he found Port Royal just as it was left. Acadian Civil War. A number of years later, Acadia was plunged into what some historians have described as a civil war between 1640 to 1645. The war was between Port Royal, where governor of Acadia Charles de Menau de Aulnay de Charnisay was stationed, and present-day St. John, New Brunswick, where governor of Acadia Charles de Saint-Étienne de la Tour was stationed. In the war, there were 4 major battles. De Aulnay ultimately won the war against La Tour. During the first 80 years the French and Acadians were in Acadia. There were 10 significant battles as the English, Scottish, Dutch and French fought for possession of the colony. These battles happened at Port Royal, St. John, Cap de Sable, Jemseg, Castine and Baleine. During the next 74 years, there were 6 colonial wars that took place in Nova Scotia and Acadia. These wars were fought between New England and New France and their respective native allies before the British defeated the French in North America. After the British conquest of Acadia in 1710, mainland Nova Scotia was under the control of British colonial government. But both present-day New Brunswick and virtually all of present-day Maine remained contested territory between New England and New France. The war was fought on 2 fronts. The southern border of Acadia, which New France defined as the Kennebec River in southern Maine. The other front was in Nova Scotia and involved preventing the British from taking the capital of Acadia, Port Royal, establishing themselves at Cancer and founding Halifax. King Philip's War. During King Philip's War, the governor was absent from Acadia and Jean-Vincent Abadie de Saint-Caston was established at the capital of Acadia, Pentguet. From there he worked with the Abenaki of Acadia to raid British settlements migrating over the border of Acadia. British retaliation included attacking deep into Acadia in the Battle off Port La Tour, Wabanaki Confederacy in response to King Philip's War in New England. The native peoples in Acadia joined the Wabanaki Confederacy to form a political and military alliance with New France. The Confederacy remained significant military allies to New France through 6 wars. Until the final war, the French and Indian War, the Wabanaki Confederacy remained the dominant military force in the region. English settlers from Massachusetts had expanded their settlements into Acadia. To secure New France's claim to Acadia, it established Catholic missions among the 4 largest native villages in the region. 1 on the Kennebec River, 1 further north on the Penobscot River, 1 on the St. John River, and 1 at Acadie. King William's War. During King William's War, some Acadians, The Wabanaki Confederacy and the French priests participated in defending Acadia at its border with New England, which New France defined as the Kennebec River in southern Maine. Toward this end, the members of the Wabanaki Confederacy on the St. John River and other places joined the New France expedition against present-day Bristol, Maine, Salmon Falls and present-day Portland, Maine. In response, the New Englanders retaliated by attacking Port Royal and present-day Guysborough. In 1694, the Wabanaki Confederacy participated in the raid on Oyster River at present-day Durham, New Hampshire. 2 years later, New France, led by Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville, returned and fought a naval battle in the Bay of Fundy before moving on to raid Bristol, Maine again. In retaliation, the New Englanders, led by Benjamin Church, engaged in a raid on Chignecto and the siege of the capital of Acadia at Fort Nashwauk. At the end of the war, England returned the territory to France in the Treaty of Ryswick and the borders of Acadia remained the same. 18th century. Queen Anne's War. During Queen Anne's War, some Acadians, the Wabanaki Confederacy and the French priests participated again in defending Acadia at its border against New England. They made numerous raids on New England settlements along the border in the Northeast Coast Campaign and the famous raid on Deerfield. In retaliation, Major Benjamin Church went on his fifth and final expedition to Acadia. He raided present-day Castine, Maine and then continued on by conducting raids against Grand Pré, Pisiquid and Chignecto. A few years later, defeated in the siege of Pemaquid, Captain March made an unsuccessful siege on the capital of Acadia, Port Royal. British forces were successful with the siege of Port Royal, while the Wabanaki Confederacy were successful in the nearby Battle of Bloody Creek in 1711 and continued raids along the Maine frontier. The 1710 conquest of Acadia during Queen Anne's War was confirmed by the Treaty of Utrecht of 1713. The British conceded to the French the island called Cape Breton, as also all others, both in the mouth of the River of St. Lawrence, and in the Gulf of the same name, and all manner of liberty to fortify any place or places there. The French established a fortress at Louisbourg, Cape Breton, to guard the sea approaches to Quebec. On 23 June 1713, the French residents of Nova Scotia were given 1 year to declare allegiance to Britain or leave the region. In the meantime, the French signaled their preparedness for future hostilities by beginning the construction of Fortress Louisbourg on Isle Royal, now Cape Breton Island. The British grew increasingly alarmed by the prospect of disloyalty in wartime of the Acadians now under their rule. French missionaries worked to maintain the loyalty of Acadians, and to maintain a hold on the mainland part of Acadia. Dummer's War. During the escalation that preceded Dummer's War, some Acadians, the Wabanaki Confederacy and the French priests persisted in defending Acadia, which had been conceded to the British in the Treaty of Utrecht, at its border against New England. Miqumaq raided the new fort at Cancer, Nova Scotia. The Confederacy made numerous raids on New England settlements along the border into New England. Towards the end of January 1722, Governor Samuel Shute chose to launch a punitive expedition against Sebastien Rail, a Jesuit missionary, at Norridgewock. This breach of the border of Acadia, which had at any rate been ceded to the British, drew all of the tribes of the Wabanaki Confederacy into the conflict. Under potential siege by the Confederacy, in May 1722, Lieutenant Governor John Doucet took 22 Miqumaq hostage at Annapolis Royal to prevent the capital from being attacked. In July 1722, the Abenaki and Miqumaq created a blockade of Annapolis Royal, with the intent of starving the capital. The natives captured 18 fishing vessels and prisoners from present-day Yarmouth to Cancer. They also seized prisoners and vessels from the Bay of Fundy. As a result of the escalating conflict, Massachusetts Governor Samuel Shute officially declared war on the 22nd of July 1722. The First Battle of Father Rale's War happened in the Nova Scotia Theatre, in response to the blockade of Annapolis Royal. At the end of July 1722, New England launched a campaign to end the blockade and retrieve over 86 New England prisoners taken by the natives. One of these operations resulted in the battle at Jeddah. The next was a raid on Cancer in 1723. Then in July 1724 a group of 60 Micmac and Maliseets raided Annapolis Royal. As a result of Father Rale's War, present-day central Maine fell again to the British with the defeat of Sebastien Rale at Norridgewock and the subsequent retreat of the native population from the Kennebec and Penobscot rivers. King George's War began when the war declarations from Europe reached the French fortress at Louisbourg first, on May 3, 1744, and the forces there wasted little time in beginning hostilities. Concerned about their overland supply lines to Quebec, they first raided the British fishing port of Cancer on May 23, and then organized an attack on Annapolis Royal, then the capital of Nova Scotia. However, French forces were delayed in departing Louisbourg, and their Micmac and Maliseet allies decided to attack on their own in early July. Annapolis had received news of the war declaration, and was somewhat prepared when the Indians began besieging Fort Anne. Lacking heavy weapons, the Indians withdrew after a few days. Then, in mid-August, a larger French force arrived before Fort Anne, but was also unable to mount an effective attack or siege against the garrison, which had received supplies and reinforcements from Massachusetts. In 1745, British colonial forces conducted the siege of Port Toulouse and then captured Fortress Louisbourg after a siege of 6 weeks. France launched a major expedition to recover Acadia in 1746. French officer Jean-Baptiste Nicolas Roch de Ramezay also arrived from Quebec and conducted the battle at Port La Joye on Isle Saint-Jean and the Battle of Grand Pre. Father Le Loutre's War. Despite the British conquest of Acadia in 1710, Nova Scotia remained primarily occupied by Catholic Acadians and Micmac. To prevent the establishment of Protestant settlements in the region, Micmac raided the early British settlements of present-day Shelburne and Cancer. A generation later, Father Le Loutre's War began when Edward Cornwallis arrived to establish Halifax with 13 transports on the 21st of June 1749. The British quickly began to build other settlements to guard against Micmac, Acadian and French attacks on the new Protestant settlements. They erected fortifications in Halifax, Dartmouth, Bedford, Lunenburg and Lawrencetown. There were numerous Micmac and Acadian raids on these villages, such as the raid on Dartmouth. Within 18 months of establishing Halifax, the British also took firm control of peninsular Nova Scotia by building fortifications in all the major Acadian communities, present-day Windsor, Grand Pre and Chignecto. Numerous Micmac and Acadian raids took place against these fortifications, such as the Siege of Grand Pre. French and Indian War. In the years after the British conquest, the Acadians refused to swear unconditional oaths of allegiance to the British Crown. During this time period, some Acadians participated in militia operations against the British and maintained vital supply lines to Fortress Louisbourg and Fort Beauséjour. During the French and Indian War, the British sought to neutralize any military threat Acadians posed and to interrupt the vital supply lines Acadians provided to Louisbourg by deporting them. This process began in 1755, after the British captured Fort Beauséjour and began the expulsion of the Acadians with the Bay of Fundy campaign. Between 6,000 and 7,000 Acadians were expelled from Nova Scotia to the lower British American colonies. Some Acadians eluded capture by fleeing deep into the wilderness or into French-controlled Canada. The Quebec town of L'Acadia was founded by expelled Acadians. After the Siege of Louisbourg, a second wave of the expulsion began with the St. John River Campaign, Petite Kodiak River Campaign, Gulf of St. Lawrence Campaign and the Isle St. John Campaign. The Acadians and the Wabanaki Confederacy created a significant resistance to the British throughout the war. They repeatedly raided Cancer, Lunenburg, Halifax, Chignecto and into New England. Any pretense that France might maintain or regain control over the remnants of Acadia came to an end with the fall of Montreal in 1760 and the 1763 Treaty of Paris, which permanently ceded almost all of eastern New France to Britain. The name Acadian was corrupted to Cajun, which was first used as a pejorative term until its later mainstream acceptance. Britain eventually moderated its policies and allowed Acadians to return to Nova Scotia.